The sun was a hammer over Arizona in the year of our Lord, 1872. It beat down on the land until the earth cracked open like a dry biscuit, showing the red dust of its innards. The heat was not a gentle warmth, but a living thing, a predator that shimmered above the rocks and baked the very air you tried to breathe. It stole the water from the sky and from the mouths of men, leaving behind a silence that was broken only by the hiss of a lizard or the lonely cry of a hawk circling in an endless, bleached blue sky. This was a land that did not care for life. It tolerated it. And in its tolerance, it made everything stronger or it made it dead. There was very little in between. Through this hard country moved Kai. He was 25 winters old, but his eyes held the stillness of the ancient canyons that had watched generations of his people come and go. He was Dine, the people, a warrior of the Navajo. He moved not upon the land, but with it, his moccasined feet making no more sound on the stony ground than the shadow of a passing cloud. His body was lean and hard, a sculpture of sinew and muscle carved by a life of running, hunting, and fighting. His skin was the color of rich copper, pulled taut over high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A simple leather band held his long, black hair back from his face. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his torso bare to the punishing sun, a testament to his endurance. Slung across his back was a bow made of juniper wood, its power sleeping until his hand called it forth. A quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers rested beside it. Tucked into a sheath at his hip was a long knife, its handle worn smooth by his palm. He carried no rifle. The Biligana, the white men, made a great deal of noise with their fire sticks, but a bow was the whisper of death, a sound the desert understood. Kai was hunting, not for sport or for glory, but for the simple, pressing need of meat for his people. He followed the tracks of a mule deer, his focus absolute, every sense tuned to the world around him. He could read the story of the land in a broken twig or a displaced stone. He knew the language of the wind and the habits of every creature that scratched out a life in this unforgiving place. His mind was a calm palm pool, reflecting the world without ripple or distortion. It was this calmness that made him a great hunter and a fearsome warrior. He had seen battle. He had felt the hot spray of blood and heard the screams of men, both his own people and the soldiers who came to drive them from their ancestral homes. The fighting had taught him that victory belonged not to the strongest or the loudest, but to the one who saw the world most clearly, who could wait and watch and act when the moment was perfect. It was a shift in the wind that first alerted him, a scent, faint and wrong, tainting the clean, dry air. It was not the smell of deer or sagebrush. It was the coppery, sweet rot of death. Kai froze, his body becoming one with the rust-colored rocks around him. His eyes scanned the horizon, missing nothing. The hawk still circled, but its pattern had changed. It was interested in something on the valley floor below. He abandoned the deer tracks. His hunter's instinct now focused on this new, ugly thing that had disturbed the desert's peace. He moved with a new kind of silence now, the silence of a man approaching danger. He found the wagon an hour later, overturned at the bottom of a dry wash like the broken carcass of some great beast. One of its wheels was splintered, pointing uselessly at the sky. The canvas cover was torn and flapping in the slight breeze. All around it was the evidence of a terrible violence. The bodies of the family lay where they had fallen. A man with a thick beard and calloused hands. A woman in a faded gingham dress. A young boy no older than 10 summers. They were Biligana, settlers, people who had crossed the Great Plains with hope in their hearts, only to find its end in this lonely, sun-scorched place. Kai looked at them not with hatred, but with a deep, weary sorrow. Their presence in this land was a source of endless conflict, yet in death, they were simply people. Their dreams turned to dust. He studied the tracks around the wagon. The scuffed earth told a story of a fight, of desperation. He saw the hoof prints of at least 5 horses, shod in the white man's way. He saw the marks of heavy boots. These were not Apache or Navajo raiders. This was the work of bandits, white men preying on their own kind, Scavengers who took what they wanted through brutality. They had taken the horses and mules, ransacked the wagon for anything of value, and left nothing but ruin behind. Kai's warrior sense told him to leave. This was not his fight. To be found here by soldiers would mean a short path to a rope or a bullet. The world of the white man was full of misunderstandings, and they rarely ended in favor of a Navajo warrior. He had a duty to his family, to his clan. Their safety was his first responsibility. He turned to go, to melt back into the canyons and forget what he had seen. But something stopped him, a small detail his eyes had registered without his mind fully grasping it. A second set of smaller tracks, leading away from the carnage. They were not the boot prints of the killers. They were lighter, more frantic, and there was a drag mark beside them, the sign of an injury. Someone had survived. A flicker of something curiosity, perhaps, or a deeper, more troublesome feeling made him hesitate. Logic told him to ignore it. A survivor meant trouble. A survivor would bring others, soldiers, trackers, men who would not care to distinguish one Indian from another. Yet the tracks pulled at him. They were the faint whisper of life in a place of death. Against his better judgment, he began to follow. The trail was difficult, a testament to the survivor's pain and terror. It led him away from the wash and up into a maze of sandstone formations that rose from the desert floor like the bones of ancient gods. There were spots of dried blood on the rocks, dark and stark against the pale stone. The tracks grew weaker, the steps stumbling. Whoever it was, they were badly hurt and running on sheer will. Kai moved with the patience of a flowing river, his eyes deciphering the faint signs, his mind piecing together the last desperate moments of this person's flight. He finally tracked the signs to a narrow fissure in a rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of sun-withered brush. The air here was still and cooler. He approached with infinite caution, his knife now in his hand. The bandits could have tracked the survivor here as well. He listened, his head cocked, hearing only the sound of his own steady breathing and the faint thrum of blood in his ears. There was no scent of the killers, only the lingering smell of fear and blood. He pushed aside a dry branch and peered into the shadows within. A girl was huddled there, Annabelle Miller, though he did not know her name. She could not have been more than 19 or 20. Her fair hair was matted with dust and blood. Her skin, where it was not covered in dirt and deep scratches, was burned by the sun. She had a terrible gash on her leg. Wrapped crudely with a strip of cloth torn from a dress he now saw lay in ruined tatters beside her. She was otherwise completely unclothed, stripped bare by the violence of the attack or by the desperate need to make a bandage. She was backed into the deepest part of the shallow alcove, her knees drawn up to her chest in a primal posture of defense. A sharp rock was clutched in her hand, her only weapon. He had expected to see terror in her eyes. He had expected a scream, or a desperate plea, or the vacant stare of shock. He saw none of those things. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, met his. They were wide, not with fear, but with a fierce, defiant blaze of life. There was pain in them, and exhaustion, and a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. But beneath it all was an unbending will, a refusal to be broken. She saw him, a Navajo warrior, armed and silent, a figure from the stories that must have haunted her people's nights. She saw the man her world had taught her to fear, and she did not hide. She did not look away or try to cover herself. Her gaze held his, direct and unwavering. It was a look that stripped away everything between them, the color of their skin, the history of their peoples, the violence that had brought them to this moment. In her eyes, he was not a warrior and she was not a white girl. They were simply two people, alone in the vast, indifferent cruelty of the desert. The sight struck Kai with the force of a physical blow. It bypassed the hunter's calm, the warrior's discipline, and went straight to the core of the man. His mind, always so clear, became a whirlwind. Every instinct, Every piece of training screamed at him to back away, to leave her to her fate. She was the seed of a great danger. Helping her would be an act of madness. It would be a betrayal of his duty to his people, inviting the wrath of the white world down upon them. They had suffered enough. He had no right to risk their safety for this stranger, this enemy. He saw the faces of his family, the trust of his clan elders. He felt the weight of his responsibility, a tangible thing on his shoulders. The path of wisdom was clear. Turn around, walk away, and let the desert claim what was left. But he could not move. Her eyes held him captive. In her nakedness, there was no shame, only a raw, terrible vulnerability that spoke a language older than tribes or nations. It was the language of survival. He saw the tremor in her hands, the ragged rise and fall of her chest with each painful breath. He saw the drying blood on her skin and knew that without water and care, the fire in her eyes would soon be extinguished. To leave her now would not be an act of prudence. It would be an act of killing. He would be no better than the buzzards that would eventually find her. The conflict tore him apart. He was Kai, the warrior, who knew the harsh laws of this land. But he was also Kai, the man who had a mother and sisters, who understood pain and loss. The desert demanded that the weak perish. His heart demanded something else entirely. He looked at the vast, empty landscape stretching out from their small shelter. It offered no answers, only silence and heat. He looked back at the girl. She had not moved, had not broken her gaze. It was a challenge, a plea, and a statement all at once. I am still here. I will not surrender. Slowly, deliberately, he sheathed his knife. The sound was soft, but in the profound silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the sound of a decision being made, a foolish, dangerous, and perhaps fatal decision. But it was a decision he knew. In that moment, he had to make. He took a small step back, away from the opening, giving her space. He would not run. He would not abandon her. He did not know what would come next, what new dangers his choice would unleash upon them both. He knew only that he could not leave this fierce, broken girl to die alone in the shadows, for better or for worse. Her life was now tied to his. His decision settled in the dust between them. Kai took another slow step back, creating more space, a deliberate act of peace. He unslung the small water skin from his shoulder, the movement fluid and unthreatening. He held it out, not approaching, but offering. Annabelle's eyes darted from his face to the skin and back again. Thirst was a fire in her throat, a torment that had overshadowed even her pain and fear for hours. Yet, the man before her was the embodiment of every cautionary tale she had ever heard. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to stay coiled in her defensive shell, but her body, cracking and failing, betrayed her. Her tongue felt thick as leather in her dry mouth, with a shuddering breath that was half sob. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Kai understood. He set the water skin on the ground, a few feet from the entrance to her small shelter, and retreated again, putting a dozen yards of sun-baked earth between them. He turned his back, a gesture of trust that was a greater risk than facing a dozen armed men. He stood scanning the horizon, his posture relaxed but alert, giving her the privacy to accept his gift. He heard the faint scrape of stone as she moved, the desperate gulping sounds as water finally met her parched throat. When he heard the soft thud of the water skin being placed back on the ground, he turned. She had retreated back into the shadows, but some of the desperate tension had left her frame. He knew she could not stay there. The fissure was too exposed, too easy to find. The sun would soon shift and bake the interior, and she was in no condition to move on her own. He needed a place of greater safety, of deeper shadow. He knew of such a place, a small cave system carved by ancient waters, a half-mile up the canyon. Getting her there would be the challenge. He pointed to her injured leg, then to himself, and then made a walking motion with his fingers through the air, ending by pointing toward the high canyon walls. She watched his hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. She understood his meaning, if not his words. Fear warred with necessity in her eyes. To stay was to die. To go with him was to place her life entirely in his hands. She looked down at the ruined, blood-soaked bandage on her leg, and the choice was made for her. She gave another, firmer nod. Reaching her was a delicate process. As he approached, she flinched, her hand tightening on the sharp rock. He stopped, holding his empty hands out, palms forward. He moved with the slow, predictable calm he would use on a spooked horse. He knelt beside her, his presence filling the small space. He gestured again to her leg. She hesitated, then slowly, painfully, extended it. The gash was ugly, deep and inflamed, the edges weeping. It was caked with dirt and dried blood. Infection was already setting in, a poison that would surely claim her. He knew he had to clean it. First, they had to move. He helped her to her feet, his touch gentle but firm on her arm. She cried out as weight came onto her injured leg, her body swaying. Without a word, he stooped and slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She stiffened in his arms, a gasp of alarm escaping her lips, her body rigid with a lifetime of ingrained fear. But his hold was impersonal, a matter of practicality, and his strength was a solid, reassuring thing. She was too weak to fight, too weak to do anything but surrender to the moment. She allowed her head to rest against his shoulder, closing her eyes against the dizzying spin of the bright sky and the pain that radiated up her leg with every step he took. The cave was a welcome relief from the brutal sun, a cool, dark mouth in the side of the cliff. He laid her down gently on the sandy floor in the deepest part of the cavern, where the shadows were thick and comforting. She was shivering now, the shock and exertion catching up to her. He took the tattered remains of her dress and laid it over her, a gesture of modesty and warmth. Then he went back to the entrance, his focus turning to the immediate task of her wound. He returned not with medicine from a black bag like a town doctor, but with the pharmacy of the desert itself. He carried a handful of silvery green leaves from a sagebrush and the pulpy leaves of a yucca plant. He built a small, smokeless fire with practiced efficiency, using a fire drill to coax a spark into a nest of dry tinder. He filled a small, hollowed stone he found with water from his skin and set it near the flames to warm. Annabelle watched him from the darkness, her fear slowly being replaced by a weary fascination. His movements were economical and precise, each action flowing into the next with an ancient, unhurried rhythm. He was a part of this landscape, as much as the rocks in the sun. When the water was warm, he knelt beside her again. He used a piece of his own leather shirt, dipped in the warm water, to begin cleaning the wound. The first touch was agony. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, her knuckles white where she gripped the sandy floor. He murmured something in his own tongue, the words low and soothing, a gentle rumble that was more about tone than meaning. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his hands surprisingly deft as he washed away the grime and blood. Exposing the true extent of the injury, when it was as clean as he could make it, he chewed the sage leaves into a wet pulp and applied the poultice directly to the gash. It stung fiercely, but it was a clean, antiseptic fire. Finally, he used strips of the yucca leaf, strong as corded leather, to bind the poultice in place. For 2 days, she drifted in a fever dream. The pain in her leg was a constant, throbbing pulse, and the faces of her family, smiling one moment and gone the next, haunted her waking and sleeping hours. Through it all, Kai was a steady, silent presence. He changed the dressing, brought her water, and sat by the entrance, a guardian etched against the brilliant square of daylight. He would disappear for hours at a time, and she would feel a pang of absolute panic, a certainty that he had abandoned her, but he always returned, sometimes with a brace of fat quail, once with a rabbit slung over his shoulder. He would skin and cook the meat over the small fire, the smell filling the cave. He would bring her a piece on a flat stone, and though her stomach churned with grief, he would wait patiently until she found the strength to eat. On the third day, the fever broke. She woke to clarity. The cave no longer a swirling, painful blur. The throbbing in her leg had subsided to a dull ache. She pushed herself up on her elbows. Kai was sitting near the fire, sharpening the head of an arrow with a piece of flint. He looked up as she moved, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no expression on his face, but she saw something in their depths, a quiet acknowledgement of her return to the world of the living. She was weak, but she was alive, and for the first time since the attack, she began to truly see her rescuer. He was not the terrifying savage of her imagination. He was a man of profound stillness and competence. She watched how he read the sky to tell the time, how he could listen to the wind and know if the weather would turn. He taught her, without words, the secrets of this place she had thought was only a barren wasteland. He showed her a small, tough green melon that, when broken open, yielded a surprising amount of water. He pointed out the roots of a certain plant that could be roasted and eaten, tasting something like a potato. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a deep and abiding respect, and something more, a fragile, budding trust. She knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that this man would not harm her. He had had every opportunity. Instead, he had saved her. He had tended to her with a gentleness that belied his warrior's exterior. He had fed her and protected her. One evening, as they sat by the flickering light of the fire, a chasm of silence between them. She felt a desperate need to bridge it, to be more than a wounded creature he was caring for. She touched her chest with her hand. "Annabelle," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly. He watched her lips as she said it again. "Annabelle." He seemed to consider the sound for a moment. Then, he touched his own chest. "Kai," he said. The name was short, strong, like the man himself. "Kai," she repeated, testing the feel of it on her tongue. A connection, as thin as a spider's thread, had been spun between them in the vast, empty wilderness. It was a start. As her strength returned, she grew restless. She was tired of being a helpless invalid. She began to help in small ways. She gathered firewood from the brush near the cave. She kept the fire going while he was out hunting. She learned to grind seeds between two stones to make a rough flour. Each small task was a victory, a piece of her old self reclaimed and a new, stronger self being forged. She was no longer just a victim of a terrible tragedy. She was a survivor, learning to live in a world she had never known existed. She watched him move, and she began to imitate him, learning to walk quietly, to pay attention to the world with all her senses. The desert was no longer just an enemy. It was becoming a teacher. She learned the difference between the call of a hawk and the cry of an eagle. She learned to recognize the tracks of a coyote. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint and baking bread, became calloused and capable. The fear that had been her constant companion was still there, a shadow in the back of her mind. But it no longer ruled her. She was discovering a strength within herself she never knew she possessed, a resilience as tough and hardy as the desert plants themselves. Her trust in Kai was no longer a fragile thing, but a solid foundation upon which she was rebuilding her life, one sunrise at a time, in the quiet solitude of their shared cave. The days bled one into another, measured not by the turning pages of a calendar, but by the slow crawl of the sun across the sky and the shifting patterns of the stars. The cave, once a temporary refuge, became their world. A rhythm established itself, a silent dance of shared existence. Kai would leave at dawn, a phantom slipping into the half-light, and return with the sun high in the sky. His hunt successful more often than not. Annabelle, her leg now healed into a puckered, angry scar, would have the fire tended, a small pile of edible roots gathered, and water replenished from the hidden seep he had shown her. She learned to scrape the hides he brought back, her hands growing strong and deft. They were no longer rescuer and victim, but partners in the stark and simple business of living. Their silence was a language of its own. Annabelle learned that a slight narrowing of Kai's eyes meant a storm was gathering in the distant mountains. Long before she could see the clouds, a certain tension in his shoulders meant he had seen the tracks of other men, and they would be extra cautious for a day or two. She came to understand his moods not through words, but through the cadence of his breathing, the way he held his hands, the focus in his gaze. He was a man of immense patience and deep reserves of calm, but she saw the flicker of other things in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. She saw a profound loneliness, a weight that had nothing to do with their survival. In turn, Kai learned the geography of her face. He learned the way her mouth tightened when a memory of her family surfaced, a ghost passing behind her eyes. He learned the sound of her quiet humming when she was content, a soft, almost inaudible tune that made the cave feel less empty. He saw the fierce determination in the set of her jaw as she mastered a difficult task, and a quiet pride would stir within him. She was not the fragile creature he had found huddled in the rocks. The desert had stripped away everything but her essence, and what remained was strong, resilient, and possessed of a quiet grace that humbled him. One afternoon, she watched him craft a new arrow, his long fingers moving with an inherited grace, shaving the shaft with a sharp piece of flint, carefully binding the hawk feathers to the end with a thread of sinew. She gestured, a questioning look on her face, and pointed to the feathers. He paused, then picked up a loose feather. He held it up, showing her how its curve would catch the air, making the arrow spin and fly true. He then motioned for her to try binding one herself. Her fingers, still clumsy with this new work, fumbled with the sinew. She wrapped it too loose, then too tight, her frustration mounting. A small, exasperated sigh escaped her lips. Kai watched her, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth tilted upwards in the barest hint of a smile. He reached over, his hand covering hers, his thumb gently guiding her fingers to wrap the sinew in the correct pattern. His touch was warm and steady, a spark that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The smile had reached his eyes, a brief, startling warmth in their dark depths. In that moment, the space between them shrank, the silence no longer empty, but filled with a new and unspoken understanding. Their life took on the shape of a small, strange family. They ate together by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. He taught her how to weave a tight, waterproof basket from yucca fibers. She, in turn, found a patch of wild herbs and began adding them to the roasted meat, a small touch of flavor that was a memory of her old life and a gift in her new one. They cared for each other. When he returned one evening with a long, shallow cut on his forearm from a cornered javelina, she cleaned it with the same fierce concentration he had once shown her, her touch gentle and sure. As she wrapped the wound, her head bent over his arm. He looked at the soft curve of her neck, the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her fair hair, and a feeling, powerful and unfamiliar, tightened its grip on his heart. It was a dangerous feeling, a tenderness that had no place in the hard world he knew. This growing connection was a constant source of torment for him. At night, when Annabelle was asleep, a still form wrapped in a rabbit fur blanket he had made for her, he would stand at the mouth of the cave and look out at the moon-drenched landscape. The silver light illuminated the path that led back to his people. He could picture them now, gathered around their own fires, listening to the stories of the elders, his place among them empty. He had a duty. He was a warrior, a protector of the Dinah. Every day he spent with this white woman was a day he shirked that duty. He was hiding, living in a hole in the rock like a coyote, all for her. The thought was a sharp stone in his gut. To the soldiers, he was a savage. To his people, if they knew, he would be a traitor, a man who had chosen an outsider, an enemy, over his own blood. There were times when the weight of this betrayal was so heavy he could barely breathe. He would grip the cold rock of the cave wall, his knuckles white and fight the urge to run, to leave her and this impossible situation behind, to reclaim the man he was supposed to be. But then he would hear her stir in her sleep, a soft sigh in the darkness, and the resolve would crumble. He could not leave her. He did not know when the responsibility of a rescuer had transformed into the fierce, protective bond of something more. But he knew it was a bond he was not strong enough to break. Annabelle wrestled with her own ghosts. She felt a profound and crushing guilt for the danger she had brought into Kai's life. She saw the way he watched the horizon, the constant, weary vigilance that never left him. She knew it was because of her. She was the reason he was in exile. He had saved her life, but she felt as if she were slowly stealing his. The world she came from had been destroyed, but its teachings were etched deep within her. She had been raised to believe his people were godless savages, a threat to be feared and eradicated. But the man who had shown her nothing but kindness, patience, and a quiet, dignified strength was the furthest thing from a savage. The beliefs of her past were a lie, and the crumbling of that foundation left her feeling lost, adrift between two worlds, belonging to neither. She owed him her life, a debt she could never repay. This knowledge was a constant ache, a feeling that she was a burden, a poison that could one day destroy the only person who had shown her compassion in this brutal land. She owed him his freedom, but she was too afraid to face the world without him. Her dependence on him was both her salvation and her shame. The cave was their sanctuary, a pocket of stillness in a world of violence. The fire they shared each night was a beacon of hope against the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert. The moon, a silent observer, would rise over the canyon, its pale light tracing the contours of the rocks, making the familiar landscape seem new and strange. It was in these quiet moments, bathed in firelight and moonlight, that their connection deepened beyond the needs of survival. It became a thing of shared looks, of small, unconscious gestures of care, of a comfortable silence that spoke more than words ever could. It was a fragile thing, this bond born of tragedy and isolation, a single flame flickering in the immense, unforgiving wilderness. And they both knew, in the deepest parts of their being, that the winds of the outside world were gathering, and it would take all their strength to keep that flame from being extinguished. The heat of the deep summer settled over the canyons, a thick, suffocating blanket that drove most living things to shadow and stillness. For Kai and Annabelle, the rhythm of survival had become a familiar, comforting melody against the silent backdrop of the wilderness. The sharp edges of their separate pasts had been worn smooth by the constant, shared present. He no longer saw her as the fragile Biligana girl, but as Annabelle, a woman whose spirit was as resilient as the wiry brush that clung to the cliff faces. She, in turn, no longer saw a fearsome warrior, but Kai, a man whose silence was a deep well of strength and whose rare, fleeting smiles were more precious than water. They had discovered a place, a small miracle tucked away in a deep fold of the canyon, a spring, born from the heart of the rock, trickled down a mossy cliff face and gathered in a shallow, sand-bottomed pool. It was surrounded by a cluster of cottonwood trees, their leaves a startling, vibrant green against the endless red and brown of the surrounding land. This pool became their private sanctuary, a place to escape the oppressive heat and wash away the dust that was a constant part of their lives. It was a place of peace, where the only sounds were the whisper of the leaves and the gentle splash of water. It was in the pre-dawn hour, that quiet, magical time when the sky is a soft gray and the air holds a hint of coolness, that Kai would rise and leave the cave to hunt. He moved through the sleeping world, his senses at their peak, reading the faint tracks left in the cool sand. This morning was no different. He had followed the trail of a small buck for 2 miles, his focus absolute, his body a seamless extension of his will. But the buck was cunning, and the trail went cold in a stretch of hard, rocky ground instead of pressing on. Kai decided to circle back toward the canyon pool, knowing that many animals came there to drink at first light. He moved with the wind in his face, a ghost among the stones, his mind on the hunt. He was still 100 yards away when he first saw the movement. It was not the cautious dipping of a deer's head or the quick dart of a coyote. It was something else, a flash of pale color near the water's edge. He froze, his body instantly low to the ground, every muscle tensed. His first thought was of soldiers or bandits. He slid behind a cluster of boulders, his bow in his hand before he was even conscious of reaching for it. He peered through a narrow gap in the rocks, his eyes straining to make sense of the shape in the dim light. And then the world stopped. It was Annabelle. She was standing in the pool, the water reaching just above her waist. She had her back to him, her shoulders and arms luminous in the gentle, indirect light of the coming dawn. She was bathing. He watched as she cupped water in her hands and let it run over her shoulders, her head tilted back in a gesture of simple, unadulterated pleasure. The sight was so unexpected, so intensely private, that it struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. It short-circuited his hunter's brain, his warrior's vigilance, and left him simply a man, breathless and still. His every instinct, every rule of honor and respect he had ever known, screamed at him to turn away. He should not be seeing this. It was a violation of the trust they had so carefully built. It was a trespass into a part of her life he had no right to witness. He was a protector, not a spy. His muscles tensed, his body preparing to back away, to melt back into the shadows and return to the cave as if he had seen nothing. But he could not move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes held captive by the scene before him. He watched, transfixed, as she turned, and he saw the long, puckered scar on her leg, a dark line against her pale skin, a testament to the journey that had brought her here. She moved with a newfound grace, no longer the injured, terrified girl from the fissure. The desert had stripped her of her old life, but it had also given her a new kind of strength, a quiet confidence that was visible in the way she held herself. The rising sun was beginning to touch the highest peaks of the canyon, painting them in hues of rose and gold. That soft, reflected light spilled down into the shaded oasis, illuminating her. Her skin was the color of desert honey in the dawn, and droplets of water clung to her like tiny jewels. She must have sensed him then. Perhaps it was a faint sound, the scrape of a pebble beneath his moccasin. Or perhaps it was something more primal, the feeling of a gaze upon her. Her head came up, her body instantly still. She turned her face slowly toward the rocks where he was hidden, her eyes, wide and startled. Found his. The world narrowed to the space of a single heartbeat. In that frozen moment, Kai expected fear. He expected a gasp, a hurried attempt to cover herself, a panicked scramble out of the water. He braced himself for the shame and anger that he deserved to see in her eyes, but it did not come. For a long second, she was as still as a statue. And then, something shifted in her expression. The initial shock gave way to something else, something deeper and far more powerful. A look of profound understanding passed between them. She saw him, Kai, the man who had saved her, tended her, and protected her. And in that moment, she made a choice. She did not hide from his eyes. She did not crouch in the water or turn away in shame. She held his gaze, her own unwavering. She straightened her shoulders, a simple, eloquent gesture of acceptance. It was an act of breathtaking courage, a statement of absolute trust. In her nakedness, there was no shame, only an open, honest vulnerability that was more intimate than any touch. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through, and everything they had become to one another. Her look said, "I have nothing to hide from you. You have seen me at my most broken. See me now, as I am." For Kai, the warrior's discipline shattered into 1,000 pieces. The conflict that had warred within him for weeks, the battle between his duty and the feelings he could no longer deny, was over. He had lost, or perhaps he had won. All he knew was that the sight of her, standing in the dawn light, offering him her trust as a sacred gift, broke through the final wall around his heart. A wave of feeling so intense it was almost painful washed over him. It was tenderness and a fierce, aching desire, all tangled together. It was the simple, overwhelming realization that this woman had become the center of his world. He lowered his bow, the movement slow and deliberate, a surrender. He stepped out from behind the rocks, into the open. He did not approach the pool, but stood on the sandy bank, meeting her gaze across the still water. The sun was climbing higher now, and the light was growing stronger, chasing the last of the shadows from their small sanctuary. The world around them was still fraught with danger, with the threat of soldiers and bandits and a future that was a complete unknown. But in this one perfect, suspended moment, none of that mattered. There was only the man and the woman, the rising sun, and the silent, unspoken truth that had finally been laid bare between them. She eventually turned and walked to the edge of the pool, her movements unhurried. She picked up the piece of worn buckskin she now wore as a simple dress and pulled it over her head. Kai turned his back, affording her the privacy she had not demanded but that he now offered as a gesture of profound respect. He heard her wringing the water from her long hair, the soft padding of her bare feet on the sand as she approached. He stood still, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting. When he finally turned to face her, she was standing only a few feet away. The silence was different now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of companions, but a silence charged with electricity, thick with all the words they did not have. Her hair was damp, clinging to her neck and shoulders, and her eyes, the color of the desert sky, seemed to see right through him, into the very core of his soul. He had never known how to proceed in a world governed by emotion rather than instinct. He had no words for what he was feeling, no actions from his past to guide him, so he did the only thing he could. He slowly raised his hand, a gesture that felt both monumental and terrifyingly small. He reached out and gently, his calloused fingers trembling slightly, touched her cheek. Her skin was cool and soft beneath his rough hand. It was a question, an apology, and a declaration all at once. Annabelle did not pull away. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a small, trusting movement that was her answer. And in that simple act, a new chapter of their story began. Not as rescuer and survivor, but as a man and a woman who had found an impossible love in the heart of an unforgiving wilderness. The touch of his hand on her cheek had changed everything, the boundary between them. An invisible wall built of culture, fear, and circumstance had dissolved in the morning light. Their sanctuary, the small cave and the hidden pool, transformed from a shared space of survival into a home, a world of their own making. A new language grew between them, one of 1,000 small gestures. The way he would tuck a stray piece of hair behind her ear, the way she would place a hand on his arm when he returned from a hunt. These small intimacies were a quiet celebration of the life they had found together against all odds. Their days were still a cycle of work, of finding food and water, but now it was imbued with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere existence. They were building something together, a fragile life in the heart of the wilderness. Their peace was a delicate bubble, beautiful and shimmering, and they had both forgotten how easily such things could be broken. It happened on a day that began like any other. The sun was a merciless eye in a cloudless sky, and the heat pressed down, making the air thick and heavy. Annabelle was inside the cave, weaving a new basket from yucca fibers, her fingers moving with a practiced skill that would have astonished the girl she used to be. Kai was outside, just beyond the entrance, patiently chipping a new head for a hunting spear from a piece of black obsidian. A small, lazy curl of smoke rose from their fire pit, carrying the scent of roasting rabbit into the still air. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a picture of a life that should not have been possible. And it was the smoke that betrayed them. Kai sensed it first, It was not a sound or a sight, but a sudden disturbance in the fabric of the desert's silence. The birds in the cottonwood trees by the spring had gone quiet, a dead stop in their constant chatter. He was on his feet in a single, fluid motion, the half-finished spearhead in his hand, his body coiled and ready. His eyes scanned the rim of the canyon above them, searching. Annabelle saw the change in him and her hand stilled, her heart suddenly a cold stone in her chest. She had learned to read his stillness, and this was the absolute, lethal calm of a hunter who has just become the hunted. Then she saw it too, a glint of sunlight on something metal high above them. A rifle barrel. A figure on horseback emerged from the rocks. Then another, and another. 4 men, their blue uniforms stark against the red rock. Soldiers. They had not been seen yet, but they were looking down into the small canyon, drawn by the wisp of smoke. Inside, Kai's voice was a low whisper, barely audible, but it held the command of a thunderclap. He pushed her gently but firmly toward the dark mouth of the cave. Stay in the back, do not make a sound. She scrambled into the deepest recess of the cave, her heart pounding against her ribs. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, making herself as small as possible. The world had shrunk to this dark, tight space, and the only sound was the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. Kai grabbed his bow and quiver, his movements swift and silent. He knew this position was a trap. The cave offered shelter, but it had only one entrance. If the soldiers came down, they would be cornered. Their only hope was to escape before they were pinned. He peered out through a crack in the rock beside the entrance. The soldiers were dismounting, beginning to make their way down a steep, narrow trail into the canyon. Their leader, a young officer with a confident swagger, was pointing toward the cave. They had been seen. "Annabelle," he whispered, his voice urgent. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the approaching men. "There is a way out, a fissure at the back. It is small. You must go now." She had never known of another exit. He had kept it secret, a final, desperate option. Fear warbled in her throat. "I will not leave you." "You must," he said, and for the first time, she heard a raw, ragged edge to his voice. "They want you. If they have you, they will kill me without a thought. If you are gone, I can lead them away. Go. I will find you." He turned to look at her then, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that seared her soul. "I will find you," he repeated. It was not a promise. It was a vow. Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. She knew he was right. She was his weakness, the leverage they would use against him. She found the narrow crack in the rock, a space she had never noticed, hidden behind a loose slab. It was a tight squeeze, scraping her shoulders and hips. But she pushed her way through, emerging into a narrow, sunless passage. She gave one last look back, saw his silhouette against the bright opening of the cave, a lone warrior preparing to face the world. And then she began to run. Kai watched her disappear. A part of him, the man who loved her, screamed to go with her, but the warrior knew better. He had to buy her time. He took a deep breath, nocked an arrow, and stepped out into the sunlight. The soldiers were halfway down the path, picking their way carefully. They stopped when they saw him, rifles coming up. "Hold your fire," the young officer shouted. He looked at Kai with a mixture of arrogance and contempt. "You Injun. There is a white woman with you. Send her out now." Kai stood silent, his bow held loosely at his side. He let his eyes drift past them, up the canyon walls, letting them think he was looking for escape. He was calculating angles, distances, noting every piece of cover. "Did you hear me?" the officer demanded, taking a few steps forward. "We know she is in there. We saw her. Give her up, and we might let you live." Kai gave no sign that he understood. He had to draw them away from the cave, away from the hidden exit Annabelle was using. He took a deliberate step to his left, moving along the cliff face. "He is running! Get him!" the officer yelled. A rifle cracked, the sound unnervous loud in the confined space. The bullet whined past Kai's head and ricocheted off the rock behind him, spraying stone chips. That was the signal. Kai broke into a full sprint, not away from them, but deeper into the canyon. A blur of motion against the red stone. He ran with the fluid grace of a deer, his feet seeming to barely touch the ground. The soldiers, burdened by their heavy boots and equipment, followed, shouting and firing sporadically. Their shots went wild, the echoes of the gunfire chasing him down the narrow canyon. He led them through a maze of stone and shadow, a landscape that was as familiar to him as the lines on his own hand. He scrambled up rock faces that seemed impossibly steep, squeezed through cracks that would have trapped a broader man, and disappeared behind outcroppings only to reappear 50 yards away. He was not just running. He was fighting. He was using the land itself as his weapon. He led them into a box canyon, a dead end, and then, as they fanned out, searching for him among the boulders, he was already climbing the sheer cliff above them, moving from handhold to handhold with the terrifying confidence of a mountain goat. From a ledge high above, he watched them. He could have picked them off one by one with his bow, but that was not his goal. Killing brought more soldiers, more trackers, more trouble. He only wanted to disable them, to stop their pursuit. He saw one of the soldiers separate from the others, moving to scout a narrow side canyon. This was his chance. Kai moved along the ledge, silent as a hawk's shadow. He found a loose pile of rocks, a small, unstable scree slope. He waited until the soldier was directly below. Then, with a powerful shove of his foot, he sent a cascade of rock and gravel tumbling down. The man cried out, a muffled curse, as the rock swept his legs out from under him. He went down hard, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His pursuit was over. 3 left. He slipped away, circling back, always keeping the high ground. He caught sight of them again as they helped their injured comrade. They were moving slower now, more cautiously, their arrogance replaced by a nervous anger. He let them follow his trail, a trail he made deliberately obvious now, leading them away from the cave, away from the direction Annabelle had gone. The sun was a brutal hammer, beating down on the canyon floor. The soldiers were sweating, their faces red and raw, their blue uniforms dark with perspiration. They were not used to this land. It was draining their strength, dulling their senses. Kai, in contrast, was in his element. He felt the heat, but it was a familiar thing, a part of him. He decided to end it. He led them to a place where the canyon narrowed, a tight passage between 2 towering walls of sandstone. He let them see him enter. Then he disappeared around a bend. He quickly scrambled up the wall, hiding himself in a shallow alcove not 10 feet above the canyon floor. He waited, his breathing slow and steady. His arrow knocked. The remaining 3 soldiers entered the passage, moving in single file. The young officer was in the lead, his pistol drawn. They were loud, their boots crunching on the gravel, their curses echoing off the walls. They passed directly beneath him. Kai drew his bowstring back to his ear. He aimed not for a man, but for the officer's pistol. He released. The arrow was a blur. It struck the officer's hand with a sickening thud, pinning it to the wooden stock of the rifle slung on his back. The pistol clattered to the ground. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain. Before the other 2 could react, Kai dropped from the ledge, landing silently behind them. He moved like a phantom. The butt of his bow came around in a hard, vicious arc, striking one soldier behind the knee. The man crumpled. The last soldier turned, his eyes wide with panic, fumbling to raise his rifle. Kai was already there. He did not use a weapon. He used his hands. A hard, chopping blow to the man's throat sent him staggering back, gagging and clutching at his neck. It was over in seconds. Kai stood in the sudden, ringing silence, his chest heaving. 3 soldiers, injured but alive, were scattered on the canyon floor. He looked at the officer, who was staring at his pinned hand with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. Kai met his eyes, and the officer saw not a savage, but a man defending his world with a skill and ferocity he could not begin to understand. Kai did not linger. He retrieved his arrow, collected their remaining weapons, and disabled them. Breaking the rifles over a rock, he left them their canteens. He would not kill them, but he would not help them either. Let their own people find them. He cast one last look at the scene of violence, the harsh sun glinting off the discarded pistol, the dark spots of blood beginning to bake into the sand. This was the cost of their love, the price of their stolen peace. He turned and melted back into the canyons, his mind now focused on a single, all-consuming thought: finding Annabelle. Finding her was an exercise in patience and faith. The vow he had made in the cave echoed in his mind, a drumbeat against the silence of the canyons. He did not search for her with his eyes, but with his instincts. He became the hunter again, but this time his quarry was the most precious thing in his world. He knew she would be smart, that she would seek water and high ground. He imagined the world through her eyes, the terror that must be her constant companion, and he used that to guide him. He found her trail, the faint scuff of a desperate journey, and followed it with a relentless focus that blocked out all pain and exhaustion. He found her 2 days later, huddled in the shade of an overhanging ledge near a small, gritty, natural cistern of rainwater. She was gaunt, her eyes wide and haunted, but she was alive. The moment she saw him, a great, shuddering sob broke from her, and she collapsed into his arms. He held her, his own body trembling with a relief so profound it was a physical pain. He held the entire world in his arms, and for a long moment, the desolate canyons, the threat of soldiers, and the impossible future all faded away. There was only the solid, warm reality of her, alive and safe. But the moment could not last. Their sanctuary was gone, and the desert, which had been their haven, was now a trap. The soldiers would return, and they would bring more men, more rifles, more determination. To stay in the open was to invite death. Kai knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that there was only one place they could go. It was a place of immense danger, a risk that made facing a patrol of soldiers seem like a simple thing. He had to take her home. He had to take her to his people. The journey was a slow and cautious one, a week of moving through the landscape like smoke, avoiding the open valleys and the known water holes where they might encounter trackers. Annabelle's fear was a palpable thing. She was leaving the known danger of the soldiers for the unknown terror of the people her world had taught her to hate and fear. But her trust in Kai was absolute. She followed where he led, her hand often finding his, a small, desperate anchor in a world that had come completely undone. They arrived at the Navajo encampment as the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. It was not a fort or a town, but a collection of hogans, the traditional dome-shaped dwellings of the Dane, scattered among the junipers and pinon pines of a high, hidden mesa. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting corn. Children were playing and laughing, chasing game among the dwellings. And women sat outside their homes, their hands busy with weaving or grinding meal. It was a scene of peace, a world away from the violence that had brought them there. Their arrival shattered that peace like a stone thrown into a still pool. A dog barked, then another. The children stopped their game, their laughter dying in their throats as they stared at the strange pair, a warrior of their own clan. And with him, a white woman. Her hair the color of sun-bleached grass, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. The women rose, their hands falling still, their faces hardening into masks of suspicion and distrust. Men emerged from the hogans, their expressions grim. The entire community, 100 pairs of eyes, fixed upon them. The silence was absolute, heavy with 1,000 unspoken questions. Kai felt the weight of their stares. He had been gone for many weeks, and he had returned with the enemy. He stood tall, his hand resting on Annabelle's arm in a gesture that was both reassuring and possessive. He saw his mother standing by her hogan, her face a storm of confusion and worry. He saw his cousins, men he had hunted and fought beside, their faces unreadable. Then, an old man stepped forward from the largest hogan. His name was Chiton. He was an elder of the clan, a man whose face was a map of old battles and older traditions. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes, deep set and black, held the accumulated wisdom and bitterness of a long, hard life. He had seen the treaties broken, had seen his people driven from their lands, had buried friends and family in the wars with the Biligana. He looked at Annabelle not as a woman, but as a symbol, a walking embodiment of all the suffering his people had endured. "Kai!" Chiton's voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "What is this thing you have brought among us? Have you forgotten who you are? Have you forgotten what they have done to our people?" "She was hurt. She was alone," Kai said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying in the still air. "I could not leave her to die." "You could have." Chiton shot back, his voice rising. "You should have. She is one of them, the poison that has seeped into our lands. Her presence here is a bad omen. It will bring nothing but sorrow and death. It will bring the soldiers to our door." A murmur went through the crowd. They were fearful words, but they resonated with the truth of their own experience. They had all lost someone to the soldiers. The fear of the bluecoats was a constant, simmering presence in their lives. "She is not poison," Kai said, his voice hardening. "She is a woman. Her family was killed by men of her own kind. She has suffered as we have suffered." "Her suffering is not our concern." Chiton took a step closer, his finger jabbing the air. "Your concern is for the people. Your duty is to us. Instead, you hide in the mountains with this white woman, forgetting your family, forgetting your clan. You have been bewitched. Your loyalty has been stolen by a pale face and yellow hair. You have betrayed us." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Betrayal. It was the deepest of accusations, the most unforgivable of crimes. Kai felt a hot surge of anger, but he held it in check. He knew that anger would solve nothing here. This was a battle that had to be fought with reason and heart, not with fists. That evening, the Council of Elders convened. They sat in a large circle inside the main hogan, the fire in the center casting their stern, weathered faces in a flickering, dramatic light. Kai stood before them, Annabelle seated on a blanket behind him, a silent, terrified observer of a ritual she could not understand. She could not follow the words spoken in the melodic, complex tongue of the Navajo. But she understood the tone. She saw the anger in Chiton's eyes, the doubt and worry on the faces of the other men, and the deep, painful conflict in Kai's proud posture. She was the cause of this. Her heart ached with a guilt so profound it was a physical weight. Chiton spoke for a long time, his voice a powerful, rhythmic torrent. He spoke of the old ways, of the duty of a warrior to his people. He spoke of the sacred lands that had been stolen, of the children who had gone hungry. He painted a picture of Kai as a man who had been led astray, who had chosen the needs of a single outsider over the safety of his entire clan. He ended by looking directly at Kai, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "He has brought a venom into our home. This act cannot stand. The stain on his honor is a stain on us all. It must be cleansed." Then it was Kai's turn. He looked at the faces of the men who had known him since he was a boy, men who had taught him to hunt, to fight, to be a man of the Dane. His heart was a battleground of conflicting loyalties. He loved these people. He would die for them without a second thought, but he would also die for the woman who sat behind him. "I have not forgotten who I am," he began, his voice low and steady. I am a warrior of the people, and a warrior protects the helpless. I found her near death. Her family had been slaughtered. She was alone. My heart told me to help her. Does our honor now demand that we let a woman die of thirst and injury, simply because her skin is a different color?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "I have lived with her for many weeks. I have seen her heart. There is no poison in it. There is only sorrow, and a strength that I have come to admire. I have not forgotten my duty. But my duty as a man, to honor life, is as strong as my duty to the clan. I have not betrayed you. I have brought a survivor among us, and I ask you to see her not as a white woman, but as a human being who has earned her place by our fire." He spoke with a simple, direct eloquence, but he could see in their faces that his words were not enough. Chiton's fear was a more powerful argument than his compassion. The elders spoke among themselves, their voices a low murmur. Finally, Hastine, the oldest and most respected of the council, a man whose wisdom was legendary, rose to his feet. His face was a mask of sorrow. "Kai, your heart is strong, and your words are true," he said, his voice heavy. "But the path you have chosen is a dangerous one. Chiton is also right. Your actions have put the clan in jeopardy. Your loyalty has been questioned. According to the old laws, when a warrior's honor is in doubt, it must be tested. A choice must be made." He looked from Kai to Chiton, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression triumphant. "You will face the Taha Agilo," Hastine declared, "the duel of loyalty. You will face Chiton at sunrise. You will fight, not to the death, but until one of you yields and honor is satisfied. If you win, you may have a place among us, though what to do with the woman is a question for another day. If you lose, you will be cast out. You will be a man without a people, a ghost in the desert. This is the law. This is the way it must be." A gasp went through the Hogan. Annabelle did not understand the words, but she understood the finality in Hastine's voice, the grim satisfaction on Chiton's face, and the look of terrible, tragic resignation that settled over Kai. He had fought the soldiers to protect her, and now, to keep her, he had to fight his own people. He slowly turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the full, terrible cost of their love. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, accepting his fate. He had made his choice. Now he would have to pay the price. The dawn broke cold and gray, a merciless light that offered no warmth, only judgment. The people of the clan gathered in a wide, silent circle on a flat expanse of packed earth that had been cleared for rituals and dances. Today, it was an arena. The air was thick with a tension that was more chilling than the morning air. Children clung to their mothers, their usual boisterous energy silenced. The men stood with their arms crossed, their faces grim and unreadable. They had come to witness a test of honor, a painful but necessary cutting away of a poisoned limb. Annabelle was made to stand apart, outside the circle, a lone pale figure in a sea of copper skin and dark hair. She was guarded by two young men who would not meet her eyes, but whose rigid posture made it clear she was a prisoner. She watched, her hands clenched into fists, her stomach a tight, cold knot of dread. This was her fault. The life of the man she loved was about to be put on the line, and it was her existence that had forged the blade. Kai and Chiton stepped into the center of the circle. They were both stripped to the waist, their bodies lean and hard. Chiton, though decades older, was a formidable figure. His muscles were corded ropes of aged power. His eyes held the cold fire of unshakable conviction. He was fighting for the soul of his people, for the traditions that had kept them alive in a hostile world. In his hands, he held a war club, its stone head heavy and lethal, and a long, wicked knife. Kai met him in the center. He held only a knife. His face was a mask of calm, but Annabelle could see the storm in his eyes. He was not just facing an opponent. He was facing his own history, his own people, The very definition of his life up to this point. He looked across the circle, his gaze finding Annabelle for a single, fleeting second. In that look, she saw everything: his love, his regret, his resolve. Then he turned his full attention to the elder. Hastine, the old council leader, gave the signal. There was no shout, no ceremony. There was only the sudden, brutal explosion of movement. Chiton came in low and fast, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence. The club, a blur aimed at Kai's head. Kai moved with a liquid grace, deflecting the blow with his forearm, the impact echoing with a dull thud. He did not counterattack. He only defended, his body a study in evasion, his knife a flickering shield. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes moving back and forth between the two men. They saw Chiton's righteous fury, and they saw Kai's reluctance. To them, it was proof of what Chiton had said. Kai's heart was divided. He would not fight with his full spirit against a man of his own clan. His loyalty was compromised. Chiton pressed his advantage, his attacks relentless. He was a master of this brutal dance. The club swung, forcing Kai to retreat, and the knife darted in, seeking an opening. A line of red appeared on Kai's ribs, then another on his shoulder. He was bleeding, the bright blood a shocking contrast to his copper skin. He stumbled, caught off balance by a sweep of Chiton's leg. The old man was upon him in an instant. The club raised for a finishing blow that would break bones and end the fight. From outside the circle, a strangled cry escaped Annabelle's lips. She saw the club begin to fall, and in that split second, something inside Kai broke. He was not just fighting for his place in the clan anymore. He was fighting for her. To lose this fight was to lose her. To be cast out alone was a sentence he could not bear. He roared, a sound of pure, primal fury that shocked the onlookers. And he rolled, the club smashing into the earth where his head had been a moment before. He came up from the ground not as a defender, but as an attacker. The change was terrifying. The reluctant warrior was gone, and in his place was the lethal hunter she had first seen. His movements were no longer just graceful, they were deadly. He flowed around Chiton's attack, his knife a living thing in his hand. He was a blur of speed and precision. He parried a knife thrust and, in the same motion, his blade slid along Chiton's arm, leaving a deep, bleeding gash. The old man grunted in pain and surprise. The duel had changed. It was no longer a test of honor. It was a battle for survival. The two men circled each other, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. The dust of the arena rose around them, mingling with the coppery scent of their shared blood. Kai was faster, stronger, but Chiton was driven by a lifetime of hatred for the world that had taken so much from him. He saw Annabelle in every move Kai made, and it fueled his rage. But Kai was fighting for something more powerful than hate. He was fighting for love. He saw a flicker of an opening, a moment when Chiton overextended himself. He moved in, not with his knife, but with his body. He disarmed the old man with a brutal twist of his wrist, sending Chiton's knife spinning into the dust. He slammed the heel of his hand into the elder's chest, knocking the wind from him. Chiton staggered back, gasping, his war club, his only remaining weapon. Kai pressed forward, his knife at the old man's throat. It was over. He had won. All he had to do was demand the yield. The circle of people held its breath. But in that moment of victory, a young warrior at the edge of the circle, a nephew of Chiton, saw only the humiliation of his elder, blinded by rage and shame. He broke the sacred law of the duel. He drew his own knife and lunged forward, charging at Kai's unprotected back. It happened in a heartbeat. Annabelle saw it. The crowd saw it. But Kai, his focus entirely on the man before him, did not. There was no time to shout a warning. There was no time for anyone to intervene. Except for her. Annabelle did not think. She did not weigh the consequences. She only acted with a cry that was a mixture of terror and pure, defiant love. She broke free from her guards. She was a flash of pale skin and flying hair. She threw herself between the charging warrior and Kai. The blade, meant for Kai's back, sank into her shoulder. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The world seemed to freeze. The young warrior stared, his eyes wide with horror at what he had done. Chiton, his breath just returning, looked on in stunned disbelief. Kai heard her cry. He felt the impact as her body struck his. He turned, and his world tilted on its axis. He saw Annabelle, her face a mask of pain, a dark, spreading stain of red on the buckskin dress at her shoulder. He saw the knife and the man who held it. The calm mask of the warrior shattered completely, and for a terrifying second, the face of a killer looked out. He raised his knife, but Annabelle's hand, her uninjured one, grabbed his arm. "No," she whispered, her voice strained. "Please." He looked from the warrior's terrified face back to hers, and the killing rage subsided, replaced by a wave of fear so cold it stopped his heart. He forgot the duel. He forgot the crowd, the elders, the judgment. He forgot everything but her. He gently lowered her to the ground, his hands instantly moving to her wound, pressing down to stop the bleeding. The blood, her blood, was warm and slick on his fingers. It was red on the red dust of his home. The circle of people broke, surging forward. Hastine and the other elders pushed through, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Chiton stood over them, his own wound forgotten, his expression one of utter confusion. The woman he had called a poison had just saved the life of his opponent, a man of the people, from the treachery of his own kin. Kai looked up, his eyes sweeping over them all, and they saw a man they no longer knew, the warrior who had obeyed their laws. The son who had honored their traditions was gone. In his place was a man who had found a new tribe, a new nation, a new world in the arms of a single woman. He rose to his feet, pulling Annabelle up with him, supporting her, his arm a band of steel around her waist. He faced them all, his gaze as hard and unforgiving as the desert rock. "You wanted to test my loyalty," he said, his voice ringing with a terrible, quiet power that cut through the murmuring crowd. "Now you have your answer." He looked down at Annabelle, at her pale, pain-filled face, and his expression softened into something that no one there had ever seen on him before. It was a look of pure, unconditional love. "Her life is my life," he declared, his voice rising, each word a stone cast at the foundations of their world. "Her blood is on our ground because of your laws, because of your hate." He looked directly at Chiton, then at Hastine, his eyes burning. "You talk of duty and honor. I have found my honor. It is with her." He pulled her closer, turning to leave the circle, to leave them all behind. "Kai," Hastine called out, his voice filled with a sudden desperation. "Where will you go?" Kai stopped but did not turn back. "I will go where she is safe." He paused, and his final words were spoken not in anger, but with the calm, devastating finality of a simple truth. "I love her," he said. "I love her more than I love the people." He then walked away, supporting Annabelle with every step, leaving behind a stunned silence, a broken ritual, and a tribe that had just witnessed the birth of a legend and the loss of a son. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the land. And as he walked into that twilight, Kai knew he was leaving his old life behind forever. He was a man without a people, but he was not a man without a home. His home was the woman leaning on his arm, the woman who had shed her blood for him, the woman who was now his entire world. They walked into the twilight, leaving the world of men behind. Annabelle leaned heavily on Kai, each step sending a jolt of fire through her shoulder. The blood had soaked through her buckskin dress, a dark, wet patch that felt cold against her skin. Kai moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his body a shield between her and the world. His focus narrowed to the single, desperate task of keeping her on her feet. He did not look back. To look back was to acknowledge the life he had burned to the ground, the people he had renounced. His world now had a population of 1, and she was bleeding in his arms. He did not speak, and she did not ask where they were going. There was no need for words. Their destination was an idea, not a place on a map. It was anywhere that was not here. They walked through the night, guided by the cold, indifferent light of the stars. The vast, silent desert that had been their sanctuary and their prison was now their only home, their only country. When she could walk no more, her body racked with pain and exhaustion, he lifted her and carried her, his steps never faltering. He found them shelter in a place the eagles would have called home, a high wind carved hollow in a sheer cliff face, accessible only by a treacherous, crumbling ledge. It was a place no one would find by accident. Here, he laid her down on a bed of soft sand. The wound was deep, the young warrior's knife having been driven by fear and rage. Kai's face, illuminated by the small, smokeless fire he built, was a mask of intense concentration. He had no surgeon's tools, only his knife, his knowledge, and his will. He cleaned the wound with water from his skin and a poultice of chewed herbs that stung and burned, but which he knew would fight the infection. She bore the pain without a sound, her eyes fixed on his face, her trust in him absolute. He bound the wound with clean strips of leather torn from his own leggings. For days, he was her hands, her feet, her strength. He hunted, he foraged, he brought her water, and he sat beside her in the long, silent hours, watching the fever rise and fall, his hand rarely leaving hers. During those days, as her body fought to heal, their roles were reversed. He was the caregiver, the constant, reassuring presence, and she was the one who had to be strong, to endure. She learned a new kind of survival, the quiet, internal battle against pain and fear. And in his tireless devotion, she saw the depth of the sacrifice he had made. He had not just chosen her over his people. He had chosen this life of exile, of constant vigilance, of profound and unending loneliness. For her, the weight of that choice was a greater pain than the knife wound. One afternoon, as the fever began to recede, she reached for his hand. "I am sorry, Kai," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He looked at her, his dark eyes questioning. "For what you lost, for your family, for your home." He was silent for a long time, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You are my home now, Annabelle," he said, his voice low and certain. "When I was with my people, I was a warrior, a son, a part of the clan. My life was a path that was laid out for me, but it was not my path. It was theirs." He looked out from their high perch at the endless expanse of rock and sky. "Here, I am only Kai, and you are only Annabelle. We have nothing but what we can make for ourselves. We are free." She understood then. He did not see it as a loss, but as a liberation. He had broken the chains of duty and tradition to claim a life that was truly his own. He had not lost a home. He had found one in her. As her strength returned, their new life began to take shape. It was a life built of shared knowledge, a constant exchange of two different worlds. He taught her the deep magic of the desert. He showed her how to read the stories in the stars, the great silver river of the sky that his people said was the path of the spirits. He taught her how to find water not just in springs, but inside the barrel cactus, how to set snares that were nearly invisible, how to listen to the whispers of the wind and know when the seasons were turning. She, in turn, gave him pieces of her lost world. She taught him her language, pointing to a rock, a tree, the sky, and giving him the English words. He would repeat them, his tongue stumbling at first, then growing sure. The sounds of her language, once the harsh tongue of his enemies, became a soft melody in their small cave. She would sing him the quiet, simple hymns she remembered from her childhood, her voice soft in the firelight. For Kai, who had only known the powerful, rhythmic chants of his own people, her songs were a thing of strange and delicate beauty. They were no longer just surviving. They were living, they worked together, moving in a silent, practiced rhythm. He would bring back a deer, and she would help him smoke the meat, her hands now as skilled as his. She found a patch of wild clay, and, using techniques she had learned from watching his mother, she crafted 2 rough, serviceable bowls. They were a small, simple thing, but they were a symbol of their new life. They were creating, not just enduring, their love, which had been born in trauma and forged in violence, now had the space to breathe, to deepen, to become a quiet, steady flame that warmed their small world. It was a love expressed not in grand declarations, but in the way he would bring her a rare, beautiful wild flower he had found on a hunt, or the way she would save the best piece of meat for him. They knew their peace was a fragile thing. The world of men had not forgotten them. Sometimes, from their high vantage point, they would see them, tiny figures moving in the vast distance below. A patrol of soldiers, a group of prospectors, a lone rider. Each time, they would retreat into the deepest part of their cave, their bodies pressed together in the darkness, waiting, their hearts beating as one, until the danger passed. These moments were a stark reminder of their reality. They were outcasts, ghosts in their own land, hunted by both worlds. They could never be careless. They could never truly rest. Their life was a constant dance on the edge of a knife. But the fear did not break them. It bound them closer together. They were a clan of 2, their loyalty absolute, their trust complete. They had only each other to rely on, and in that reliance, they found a strength they had never known before. One evening, as a full moon rose, flooding their canyon with a light as soft and bright as silver, they sat at the entrance to their cave, looking out at the world. The desert, so harsh and unforgiving by day, was transformed into a place of breathtaking beauty, a landscape of silver and shadow. Annabelle leaned her head on Kai's shoulder, her healed wound a faint ache that was a constant reminder of the price of their freedom. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice quiet. He was silent for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "The future is tomorrow's sunrise," he said. "It is finding water. It is you, beside me." It was the only future they had, the only one they could be sure of. It was a future filled with danger and uncertainty. They would face storms and drought, hunger and fear. The world of men would always be a shadow on the horizon. But as she looked at his strong, calm profile against the moonlight, at the man who had given up everything for her, Annabelle knew it was enough. They had survived the fire. They had walked away from the ashes of their old lives. And here, in the heart of the vast, beautiful, and terrible wilderness, they had found a love that was a world unto itself. Their future was an unwritten page in a book they would write together, one sunrise at a time. It was a dangerous, uncertain, and beautiful story. And it was theirs. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and press that hype button to help share this tale with more people.